For faculty, supporting Capstone multilingual writers, giving grammatical feedback to Capstone multilingual writers, Part 2. This is Part 2 of 2 on giving grammatical feedback to Capstone multilingual writers. In Part 1 of this video series, I discussed why Capstone multilingual writers may continue to make grammatical errors, why grammar feedback is important, how writers learn to fix grammatical errors, and some best practices for grammatical feedback. In this video, Part 2 of the series, I will show some examples of grammatical feedback with different approaches: direct, indirect, and scaffolded, and with different formats: bubble comments, in-text comments, and highlighting. In this first example, I use direct feedback with in-text edits. I also use modeling and linking to resources so that the writer has a place to go for further support. The grammatical issue in this first example was a lack of parallelism in a lettered list. Each item in the lettered list should follow the same grammatical structure. So, in this example of direct feedback, I made an in-text edit to the document and I changed the sentence to make it parallel in structure and grammatically correct. Modeling can be an effective technique, especially when we think about the idea that I referenced in Part 1 of this video series, that students may not know what they don't know. I also hyperlinked out to a resource on the Form and Style website about the error, parallel construction, and I encourage the writer to continue looking for this type of error throughout the text. The next two examples on this next slide show direct feedback with in-text edits. In these examples, I used modeling, I explained the grammatical errors, and I linked out to the Form and Style resources for the student to learn more. The first example sentence here reads, I completed a pilot study and obtained feedbacks from 2 experts. The issue here is that the noun feedback is a non-count noun in English and therefore should be singular. My resources then direct the student to more on articles and count versus non-count nouns. The second example sentence reads, I interviewed 10 participants at the afternoon. In this case, there is a preposition error because in English, the preposition in is used for parts of the day. I again link out to a Form and Style resource on prepositions for more support. On this next slide, I have one last example of direct feedback. In this case, I use modeling of multiple choices, I explain the grammar rule, and I again link out to resources. The sentence reads, in 2022, many researchers have studied how small business owners can be successful beyond the initial few years in business. The error here has to do with verb tense, specifically the difference between the present perfect, have studied, versus the simple past tense, studied. My comment then explains this error. I say, the present perfect tense is not used with specific periods of time, but instead to describe past events without a specific time frame. I next give some options. I say, you could revise this to the simple past. In 2022, many researchers studied how small business owners can be successful beyond the initial few years in business. Or you could remove the specific time frame and keep this in the present perfect. Many researchers have studied how small business owners can be successful beyond the initial few years in business. Finally, I link to a blog post and to a website page on the Form and Style website addressing these differences in verb tense choices. This next example uses indirect feedback and highlighting. In a bubble comment, I explain my approach to the feedback so that the writer understands what I'm doing. I also encourage the writer to ask me if they have any questions about the highlights. Note, however, that I don't explain each type of error and I don't fix it for the writer. I have to say that as an instructor, this is my very favorite way to give grammar feedback on a document. When I was teaching full-time and had, for example, 120 students in a semester, I couldn't take the time to fully explain what was going on at the sentence level in each individual paper and each draft of each paper that I read. However, my students still wanted and they still expected grammar feedback and support from me, and I found this highlighting technique to be really successful. I pointed out where errors were, but the students then had to go back and figure out what the error was and how to fix it. And I found that they were usually able to do so without my help, which was awesome. Of course, if they really didn't know how to fix the error, they could come and ask me. Not only did this method save me a ton of time as an instructor, it also didn't force me to identify and explain each type of grammar error. For the student, it really helped raise self-awareness of grammatical errors and help them to develop self-revision and self-editing skills. I've actually been trying this method with my own children recently as well. I have an 8th grader and an 11th grader who sometimes ask me to edit their papers before submission. I don't want to revise the papers for them because that isn't my job as mom. Instead, I will often highlight errors, and both of my kids are able to fix them correctly almost every single time. On this next slide, you can see an example of indirect feedback and color-coded highlighting. I've used this technique when teaching students whose level of English is too low to just highlight all grammatical errors in one color. In the example on this slide, you can see that I focused on 5 types of grammatical error: subject-verb agreement in yellow, verb tense in blue, singulars and plurals in red, articles in green, and prepositions in pink. Even if there are more than 5 types of grammatical error in a document, I might only decide to focus on a handful of errors anyway, because too many error types could be overwhelming to both you as the one giving the feedback and to the writer who is receiving the feedback. Using summary comments is another way to provide indirect feedback. Here is an example of something I may write at the end of a document. I say, as I read through your draft, I noticed that there are some errors in word forms, nouns versus adjectives especially, restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, and the missing serial comma. Be sure to look for and continue revising for these 3 issues as you go back to revise again on your own. In this summary comment, I've given 3 specific areas to focus on, and I provide hyperlinks back to more resources about these errors, but I do not point out where each type of error is and specifically how to correct it. My last example slide shows some scaffolded feedback. Instead of just thinking about giving direct feedback or giving indirect feedback, we can scaffold the feedback. This would be where we start by giving direct feedback the first time the error appears, or maybe the first few times the grammatical error appears, and then move to more indirect feedback for subsequent errors. This approach not only saves you time in giving feedback, it also again encourages the writer to become a more independent writer and reviser. In the example here, the writer referred to themselves in the third person as the researcher. However, APA and Walden specifically says to use the first person I for self-reference. So, the first time the error appears using the third person, the researcher, instead of the first person, I explain the rule and make an in-text edit to the document. In the subsequent instances of this error, I just highlight it and move on. This highlighting technique again is fast and saves me a ton of time as the person giving feedback, but it also helps the writer know where and how to revise. For more support, please watch part 1 of this video series. In part 1, I discuss why Capstone multilingual writers may continue to make grammatical errors, why grammatical feedback is important, and how writers learn to fix grammatical errors, as well as some best practices for grammar feedback. I also suggest bookmarking and visiting the faculty support for working with Capstone Multilingual Writers page, located on the Office of Research and Doctoral Services website under Form and Style Resources. I've included the URL on this slide. This page contains information on Capstone Multilingual student writing support resources that you can share with your students. There is also a series of SMART guides, which are PDF how-to guides for faculty supporting Capstone Multilingual writers. In addition, there are other videos like this one on different aspects of supporting Capstone multilingual writers. I hope you find this information helpful as you continue to support Capstone multilingual writers here at Walden.